Hey, what is up guys, and welcome back to Predatory Exotics. Today we have a video in a series that we've done for quite a while. We haven't had a new tank though in a while. Today we are doing the mini Paludarium Exoterra tank. You can see here is a new one that we happened to pick up off Facebook luckily. So we're going to unbox it first and then go through all the possible animals and give you some suggestions if you have this tank at home as to what you could keep, because there's such a wide variety for such a tall skyscraper-like terrarium. So this is obviously the mini extra tall terrarium from Exoterra. This is one of their Paludarium style tanks. So I'll explain in a minute about how this differs from a normal Exoterra. It does have different dimensions on certain parts of the tank. But for now, we'll talk about what is different between the normal versions. So the mini Exoterras are 30 centimeters base by 30 by 30 base, so a foot by a foot. This is exactly the same as those, and then you can get the 30 cube and then the 45 tall. This one is the extra tall, so it is actually 60 centimeters tall, so 2 foot high. So it's really great for your arboreal species. Sorry, I don't want to unwrap it and do it at the same time because it seems to be rustling on the microphone. But it's a really good tank for your arboreal species, and it does differ slightly in the bottom of the tank. You have a much larger area that you can put a water in the bottom. So that means you can have fish in it as well as your reptiles or amphibians that we'll talk about in a minute. So it is a really good tank to have, and it's definitely a different feature to the normal ones. So as you can see, it pretty much looks or has all the same normal features of the Xterra, the mesh, the locking, has all your bits for your cables at the back. But you will notice you get an exclusive background with this one. Usually you get the rock background, but because it's supposed to be like a tree trunk forest, you're in the canopy, they give you this background, which is quite cool. It's like a almost looks like a root system, or like one of those like strangler fig trees or something like that. So that's very cool, very different as well. So not sure when we eventually fill this tank whether we will use that background, because we do tend to use our own custom backgrounds. But it looks pretty cool, and if you're after a different feature and an easy setup, then this background might look very cool for you. So let's talk about some of the reptiles and amphibians that you can get inside this tank. As a paludarium with this large bottom portion, you can fill that up with water and almost have like a mini aquarium at the bottom. With that large amount of water, obviously means amphibians are a great fit for this tank. If you wanted a completely false bottom, you could go with reed frogs inside this enclosure. They naturally live on the reeds overhanging bodies of water, so they'd be great for this tank. Other ones include the clown frogs and the giraffe frogs, really colourful frogs that are highly arboreal. You can either do half land or half water, really cool. Glass frogs are tricky to get hold of in the UK at the moment, but a really cool option because you can see all their organs through the glass, so that is very cool. And then one of my favorites, unfortunately you can't get mossy frogs inside this enclosure, but a close cousin is the bird poo frogs. Instead of looking like green moss, these ones look like bird poo. Sounds a bit strange, but would be really cool inside this tank, especially if you had some cork bark going around. They would camouflage in perfectly. You can also keep some of your dart frog species, some of the smaller ones, not the Dendrobates ones. Any of the thumbnail dart frogs obviously are very small, so you could get quite a few in here. And a couple of your bumblebee dart frogs, the Leucomelus dart frogs, also a very good option. Some of the getting onto slightly larger species of frogs, so some of the tree frogs, you could get the lemur tree frog, which is a very cool option, grey tree frog and green tree frog, and then one of the favourites, an alternative to the red-eyed tree frog, is the tiger-legged monkey frog. Instead of having those blue sides like a red-eyed tree frog would have, these have tiger stripes, so they're super cool, and once they start moving around when it gets to the end of the evening, super cool to watch them explore around your terrarium. So moving on from your amphibians, let's get on to some reptiles, and the perfect small reptile for this size enclosure is going to be your geckos. So mainly it's going to be day geckos. So I'm going to list off quite a few now. You've got either the neon day gecko, the line day gecko, the peacock day gecko, the gold dust day gecko, and then slightly more expensive but very worth it is the electric blue day geckos, where the males are a turquoise blue that is super cool, and you can get a nice pair. The female unfortunately is more of a brownish color, but it'd be a great addition to this enclosure. Some of the other smaller arboreal geckos you could have the Cameroon dwarf geckos, which look a bit like a day gecko, and the yellow-headed geckos as well. Some of the slightly more expensive and harder to get ones would be your Strophosaurus, the spiny-tailed geckos from Australia. You probably wouldn't do any water at the bottom because they're slightly more arid species, but you could have a really thorny, sticky enclosure going all the way up, and that would be perfect for them. You get your Bowers chameleon gecko, which not a chameleon, it's a gecko. They're coming up in popularity, the Bowers chameleon gecko, and you could definitely get a few inside this enclosure. I know one of Ollie's most wanted species is the Malaysian cat geckos. They curl up inside the leaves of bromeliads in a sort of tropical environment, so that would be cool. And your satanic leaf-tail geckos, one of the smaller species of leaf-tail geckos. You could get in here, do some dry leaves and a sort of tropical environment. Super cool camouflage on these species, and because they're so small, you could probably keep a couple inside this enclosure. And then the Mediterranean house gecko is also a very cool option, and if you wanted a very large colony, you could go for some mourning geckos as well and have your own parthenogenic babies of mourning geckos. So that last list was geckos that could live in this size enclosure for their entire life. Now I'm going to come up with some more popular ones that would need upgrades in the future. So your subadult crested geckos, if you wanted a crested gecko, this would be a great juvenile enclosure for them. Also, along with that, obviously, comes your gargoyle geckos and your chahua geckos, which are slightly more expensive and good alternatives for the crested gecko. And then, obviously, the big boy, the Leachianus gecko, gets massive. So you could only have a baby in this enclosure, but it's a great arboreal starter kit for that size of gecko. But again, you would definitely need to upgrade it in the future. So there isn't really many snakes that can live their entire life in an enclosure this size. It doesn't really have enough floor print to stretch their body out, but it is a very good vertical space for your arboreal species. So baby snakes such as your green tree python and the Amazon tree boa, they both are very similar. Obviously they're from completely different areas of the world, but they have a similar positioning in terms of body. So they will curl up on the bamboo that you would lay across lengthways across this enclosure, and they would sit in there for most of the day. So a very cool species and definitely a good baby snake to have in this size enclosure. Some of the other ones, I really want an egg-eating snake. Obviously their diet is very specific, and when they are babies you will need finch eggs to feed them, which can be tricky to get hold of. They're even smaller than quail eggs, but they will definitely do well in an arboreal setup like this. You could put some twigs, leaves, stuff like that, and then have a bird's nest in the center, and then they will pick out the eggs from that, which is a very cool to watch and definitely one I want to get in the future. The other couple snakes you could get inside this enclosure as babies would be the rough green snake and the smooth green snake. These ones are very good if you don't want a mammal eater. They will eat insects, very specific diet, and you need a tropical bioactive setup for these. That is what they best live in. So that's it for snakes, that's it for reptiles. Hopefully that has given you some good ideas. So I hope that has given you some ideas for if you have this tank at home, or if you're thinking about getting this tank. I think it is an absolute awesome product from Exoterra. It's definitely some out-the-box thinking for people that want to create a real environment inside their own home. We haven't talked about what sort of fish and stuff you could get at the bottom. We're not massively into fish here. You would have to look it up. All I would say is, if you're like me, you want to try and get a fish from the same area that the amphibian or reptile's from, because that way you're pretty much completing the entire environment for that animal, which I think is an awesome thing to do in your own home. But for now, hope you've got some ideas. Please let us know if you have this tank or you are thinking about getting this tank, what animal you are or going to put into it. Comment that down below and let us know. But for now, leave a like, comment that down below, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next tank suggestion video.